Greetings from the Civil Inspiration Galaxy. Tips for better looking surfaces and contours. They're not as bad as you think they are. I'm StarLordJames, and I'll be talking to you today about some issues on how to make your surfaces look better, some settings, some contours. I have some questions maybe you can answer, maybe not. Do you know the right way to import contours? And what I mean by the right way are, what are the best settings? Are you using the AutoCAD defaults? Do you really know what all those other little extra boxes and check boxes and little minimum settings are? Can you really make Civil 3D contours look good? Yes, you can. Do you need to model every contour line to make them look good? Nope, you do not. But how can you smooth them if they don't come out right? Well, there are plenty of ways to smooth. There's definitely two ways that I'll show you. What other potential issues can come up? Sometimes when you're using the smoothing, or some of the settings that you set before or using the defaults can cause issues. How do you edit those settings, or how do you change things at the end? So if this looks like what you want to hear today, then you're in the right spot. Let me talk about one of the first things, mainly when you're importing the contour data inside of a surface. There is some checkboxes and some other factors that dictate what Civil 3D is doing. So this is Autodesk default. This is some of the information that they just put in here. Notice they have filling in gaps, and that's something you want to do. They have swapping edges unchecked. They have adding points to flat triangled edges, and this to me is a very bad one. This one does a lot of weird stuff that I don't like what it does to the surface. And then there's adding points to flat triangled edges. One of the things you'll notice here on this adding points to flat triangled edges is it adds these little points automatically along a contour line like this dashed green line here. So basically it's automatically adding these little points in there. And that piece of data kind of stays and hangs in there. Actually, all of these kind of stay in there and hang. Let me show you what I'm talking about. All right, so I have just a simple drawing here. And some of my students call this the avocado drawing because they look like avocados. Basically, they're just two polylines. So if I click on this guy and go to properties, it's going to be giving me a polyline, and they both have an elevation. The top is at 10, and I think this is the bottom. I think they're just berms. Is at 19. Oh, nope, so they're basins. All right, so let's just say I want to create my own surface here. I'm just going to start with a brand new one. I'll leave the name because this isn't that part of the class. Let's go to surfaces, go down to the definitions, and this is what I'm talking about, the settings. So when you're importing the contours, how are you importing them? So I'm going to go to add. This should be set back to 1. So this is the Autodesk defaults. Is this one right here. I'm going to hit OK, and then I'm going to bring in these two lines. And this is the contours that I get. And notice the little extra pieces here. If I go into this surface definitions, this should be one thing I'm going to talk about in a minute. If I go to the surface definitions, you can see added contour data, and it has this other one called minimize flat areas. I want to talk to you in a minute about what this is and how to turn it off and how to avoid potential issues with that. Now let's talk about maybe I want them to look a little smoother. This isn't going to be perfect, but it at least gives you the idea. I'm going to right click again on the contours. And this time I'm going to make some changes. The main change that I really want to do is the 0.01. Why is that? Well, the 0.01 will basically set along mid-ordinate distance, which is along a curve. So right now, on the 1 foot, it's basically putting a little AutoCAD surface point, or vertex, along the line that you drew or imported for your contour, and it's doing it every 1 foot. So here's a point, and then it goes across to a 1 foot away. And that makes the contours look pretty chunky. These ones, on the other hand, if you do 0.01, makes them look a lot smoother. So let me just go into that one. And let me change, well, I'll talk to you about the other ones too. The weeding factors, it just means it's going to take out information. The supplemental factors is just going to add in. The little downside about this one, if you change this one, then you have to, basically, this one has to be smaller than that one. It's just the way that it is. Supplemental distance means that this is along straight lines. The only time I usually change this is when I'm sending a surface to Revit and they need really tight topo lines so they can see the curbs and retaining walls and that information, but that's for a different class. But basically I'm going to go ahead and make these changes here, and then I'm going to change some of the settings down here at the bottom. So I had 0.25 and then 0.5. There are no straight lines on here, they're all curved, so it doesn't really matter. Fill contour gaps, yes. Swapping an edge, yes. If you don't know what that is, you should take one of our surface classes. I definitely explain how to do swapping edges. It's something you need to know how to do. And then I'm going to turn on this adding point to flat triangled edges. So that way it's not going to add those little extra points there. So if I hit OK, and then select these two guys, those contours are a lot better looking, right? But as you can see from the triangulation being on, it puts a lot more triangulation in there. So you do need to be a little careful when you're doing this kind of information over very large projects. Maybe you can adjust that mid-ordinate distance to be a bigger number. The 0.01 is the minimum, so you can basically change it to whatever you want. So like I said right here, upside, you got smoother contours, better volume calcs because you have a tighter triangulation. The downside is you have a lot more surface points. So that can make the surface run a little more challenging for the surface. All right, let's talk about the next piece. We're not talking about feature lines or break lines, but I just want to show you that they have similar import options, and that mid-ordinate distance is really, really, really important. Right here you can see these are the curve returns. Which curve return would you rather have? These two on the left, or the two on the right? This is probably what you're used to seeing, and you probably hate it. So this is, again, one of the better options. And you can see the supplemental factors here for the 0.5. So if you look on this side, you'll see the triangulation basically goes to the end of the end of curve. And then over here, it goes to the end of curve, and then it adds another vertex or triangulation every 0.5. So that's just how you get it much tighter. Like I said, you only really need to do that when you're using Revit. All right, so let's talk about smoothing options. So how can you smooth a contour? So maybe these aren't the contours you're looking for. So this is option 1. Your contour data is only going to look as good as the data you give it. And what I mean is, if you look at this image up here, you can see that this is these gray lines right here are the existing data. And basically what they gave us is a very nasty looking survey here. If I can open that file up. Is it this one? Yeah. So this is the contour from the survey. So it's just like a straight chunk right here. Not very nice. I mean, there are ways to clean this up. You can definitely try. So what you can do, since you've already imported the data and you already imported this line, I'm just going to go to the Modify panel, and this is a little tip. Go to the Delete PI for feature lines, even though this is just a regular old polyline. So this is nothing more than a polyline here. And basically I'm going to say delete, and I'm going to delete this point, and then if I zoom in I can see that there's even an extra little point down there. So be careful about all those little tiny extra vertices. Those can cause your surface to do weird things as well. Then I'm just going to convert this line real quick to an arc and try and get as close to tangent as possible. If you want to do tangents, I recommend using the line and curve tools or the alignment tools. But let's set this to rebuild, and let's see if it adjusts some information here. So it did. Didn't make them too much better. And why is that? Well, this one's a little wavy down here, and it's got a lot of little chunks in it. So you can see all these vertexes are basically dictating the triangulation. So let me turn on the triangles. This is why you should have the triangles on whenever you're designing, so that way you can see what's going on. So I'm just going to make them pretty light, so that way they're not in our face. So here's the triangles. So this is what Civil 3D is trying to do, is it's basically trying to take a surface here, and what it's trying to do is it's trying to take a vertex, and it's drawing a triangulation line across to the closest next point that it can find, and then the same thing. And it just keeps doing that until it completes triangles. Along the curve here, remember that little parameter is about the 1 foot. So this is the 1 foot mid-ordinate distance that's set to this line right now. Well, what happens if I change this line to be a little less? So here's another tip for you. I'm going to erase this line out of the data. So I'm going to say erase. And then if I use undo, what it's going to do is it's going to add it back into the surface definitions. And I don't want it to do that. So I'm going to use oops, and I'm going to bring back that line. Then I'm going to add the line in back by itself. I'll right click and say add. I'm going to make sure my mid-ordinate distance is set to 01. I'm going to get rid of that add the flat thing and just do some swapping edges, and then I'll select this line here. Now I have this other issue going on. What is this? And I'll talk about that in a second. So basically on that, there is a little issue here that is all these little lines that are going across like this. And what these are is not to confuse everybody, and I'm sure most people don't even know this exists. So we all know about the points that are inside of Civil 3D, these COGO points. We've all heard of AutoCAD points. And then when people say surface points, they're not talking about these ones. They're talking about the ones that are actually for the triangulation. So I need to turn those on. So I'm going to go to the surface style, and we're talking about these points, the surface points. You can adjust the sizes if you don't like them and the colors. But I'm going to go back to the display, and I'm going to turn on the points here, and I'll say OK. Now, there's a different types of points depending on what it is. You can see these ones that are like crosses. These are the vertexes that are added along the actual line that you made. These ones with the circles on them is what Civil 3D is trying to minimize the flat area. And what do I mean by that? Well, remember that little checkbox when we went to the surfaces, and we went here and we said let's bring in a contour, and we had this little checkbox. So whoever built this surface originally just left the defaults of AutoCAD, and that's what it was. How do you get rid of those? We're not going to talk about this. I say take a class, but there are surface edits, and I really am not a fan of people doing a lot of these different edits, so you can delete points and stuff. The problem with that is then basically your surface builds a timeline of everything you do in order that you do it, and sometimes that timeline gets pushed around, and I'll show you what the timeline looks like in a minute. But basically you need to, it just basically adds in more and more stuff for you to filter and more stuff for you to figure out. Now when I'm talking about the timeline, if you go to the surface properties and then you go to the definitions tab, this is your best friend right here. We'll talk a little more about some of this other stuff up here at the top, but right here is the operations. So somebody who originally built this put the contour data, and then here's that checkbox. So those little checkboxes that are there are basically the minimize flat area. So it says fill in gaps, add points to flat triangled edges, and add points to flat edges. And that matches the exact import checkboxes that are right here. So this is also an edit that goes in with your contours, and these little checkboxes dictate what it's saying on here on this back parameters. Now I know that this add points to flat triangled edges is not that great. So what you can do here is, I didn't know this for a very long time, but you can actually uncheck these, and then you can hit apply and rebuild, and then it takes away that edit. However, it is no longer applying the filling gaps, and if you had swapping edges, it would no longer apply that as well. My best suggestion is just remove this data and then re-import it. Use the oops command and bring it in. That's how I clean out the surface a lot. When you do that, when you delete the data in here, you got to remember to delete these, because sometimes these don't delete. Sometimes when you delete contour data, especially if you're just deleting one or two contours, it leaves this in here. So that's what's happening, is even though that contour was a part of this, this now had this problem here with this these extra points that are here. So I basically I don't want to deal with that. All right, so what else is next that we can look at here? Oh, I should go back to that. So you can see that the contours are looking a little better, but they are dictating on, or they are using all the vertexes that are along this line, which is why they don't look so good. So my suggestion is basically to draw in the lines manually. And do you have to draw every line? No. Please no, don't draw every line. So what you can do is, I'll open up another file here. Oops. Hold on one second. I didn't have my... Okay. I apologize, but basically now what I've done is I've set the style to be a little different so I can see the colors too. So you can see the contour colors here. And the red lines are just polylines that I've drawn. Whenever you draw the polyline command and then you use one of the regular AutoCAD snaps, it will automatically go to the elevation of that polyline. So that's a little tip as well. So that way you don't have to sit there and click on each one and try and figure out what to set the elevation of the properties. So all I did is I drew a polyline right here, and I drew another one that's a little ways down to right about here to kind of smooth that out. These are the existing ones that were already there. So you can see those are definitely some crazy looking lines, but that's what comes in from surveys. So let's go ahead and import these. So what I'm going to do is go over here to definitions, and I'll go to contour, and I'll say add. You can give these names. I'm not very good at that. I don't really give them names, but it would make more sense because then you would see that description. Well, let me just put a name in here in the definitions. And then I'm just going to do my normal settings that I usually do. So remember, you want that mid-ordinate distance. That's really important for those curves. And we don't want to do that flat triangle edges. I'm going to say OK. Then I'm going to select this one, and I'll select this guy, and then I'll hit enter. And now it gives me a much nicer looking surface, or contours. Again, the triangles are a little extra, or there's a little excess of them. So if I go to triangles, and let's just turn those on, you can see with that 0.01, it really adds a lot more triangulation lines. But like I said, it makes your surfaces look smoother, your contours look better, and your volumes come out even tighter. Okay, so the next part is, once you have those, you can still see it's a little bit chunky here, so we'll modify that in a second with the second. Okay, so that's a good method. That's method 1, or option 1. You can still see this part right here does not look as nice as you'd probably want it to look. You want that contour to be even smoother. So I'm going to talk to you about option 2. So let's go on to option 2 here. And I can make this PDF available for you guys afterwards, so that way you have the step-by-steps. So this is option 2. It's a different place, except we're going to go into the edits. We are going to use this tool called Smooth Surface. You can also click on a surface, go to Edit Surface, and say Smooth Surface. What this does is it brings up a little dialog box, and then you would never know that in this dialog box because it doesn't really tell you, but you have to select the output region. And the way to do that is to find this hidden button that's here. Sneaky Autodesk puts a little hidden button. I'll show you when we get there. And then you're going to adjust some grid spacing, and we're going to see this number of output points. And we want to keep this one down. I've found over the years, try and keep it down low. 60,000 is where computers really start to hurt. And that's adding 60,000 points to your surface. So you can imagine how crazy that's going to look. So basically you have something like this, something better, and then, but it adds a lot of points. So we'll talk about that in a sec. Let me just go in here, and here we have the one we've been working on. And let's just say I want to smooth this area. You probably shouldn't apply both of the methods that I've done to the same area, because sometimes it over processes. You should also clean up the surface too. So remember I said going to the surface definitions? I think this one has a lot of extra junk. So if I really don't need these in here, it's best just to right click on them and say remove from definitions, and then they'll no longer be causing a mess inside of my surface for me. But I'm not going to do that. So basically what I'm going to do now is I'm going to draw a polyline. Make sure you don't do a polyline like this. So these are the two lines that I've used to create the contour, right? So if I should not cross the lines or cross the data. Sometimes you're okay, sometimes it'll be fine and you can go across a wide area. But sometimes when there are stuff like on this surface where there's these little extra points in here, you get a lot of weird, crazy things going on, and you just shouldn't cross an area. So this is the bad line. This is the polyline that I drew, and make sure it's all straight segments. Don't do any curves. So just do, little points here and there, and just draw a nice little area where you want to smooth. So from there, we can basically say, all right, let's go with the smoothing option now. So what I'm going to do now, let me just hit rebuild real quick. And I'm going to go to the edits, and I'm going to go to smooth surface. Here's that little tricky box that I was telling you about, and there's no place on here that says, hey, click here. You just got to kind of know this, hopefully. But basically, you're going to go to select output region, and right here is where that hidden button is. I know, right? All right, so if you click on it once, you're going to see the three little dots. This little button right here is called the ellipsis. Click on that, and sometimes it does this weird glitch. I don't know why. But if you click again, now it's asking me a question. So it's saying down in the command line, smooth surface, select a region. So do you want to do a rectangle? Do you want to select a polygon? Or do you want to do a surface? Please don't ever do a surface. Don't do the entire surface. Unless you're doing a really small project that's a couple acres, you can probably get away with it. And also depending on your grid spacing. But but don't do it. You're going to sit there forever. You're going to hang your computer up, and it's going to crash, and it's never going to come back. So what you should do is basically, now you just select the polyline that I have, and then I'm just going to hit enter, and it's saying select output region 1. I think it did the little glitch because I already had it selected previously. Right here is grid spacing. If you're familiar with volume calculations, remember how we would do hand calcs, and we do them based on grids. So basically it's the same principle. And there's also grid surfaces, which is like what Google Earth uses and so on. So those surfaces are so large that they basically just are in these little tiny squares. And the triangles are just square-based. What this is going to do is the smaller the number, the more squares it has, which the more points it has. So down here, once we put in a number, it's going to tell us what the numbers are. So I'm going to go with the spacing. And sometimes, depending, I'll do 0.5. But you got to remember, also think of what you're plotting, like what scale. Is this 20 scale? Is it 40 scale? I'm going to try 2, just to see what 2 looks like. So for 2, basically I'm going to do a grid of 2 foot by 2 foot squares. And it's going to add 1,500 new points. That's a lot of points. So I'm just going to hit OK. And then down here at the bottom, we'll watch the little computation process. And once it's completed, you'll see this contour will be nice and smooth. Those are the contours that you're looking for, aren't they? However, here's the drawback, like I said. So if I go back to this guy, and I go to the surface style, and let's just turn on the triangulation, or even the points for that. Well, no, that'll be too much. And I hit OK, you're about to be blinded. So this is what happens. Basically, it's making a 2 foot by 2 foot grid. But that's what makes the surface look really, really nice. So if you want your contours to look good, you just got to kind of find the trade-offs. Sometimes I found the number here between 2 and 5 works pretty well. The last thing, like I said, I want to talk to you about was that definitions and how you should use it. So inside of the definitions, there is a build spot. And a lot of people use this. Maybe you have some points or something, some data that's below a certain datum. So maybe you know your project nothing goes below 200 feet or whatever meters or whatever your project happens to be in. And you can say, I want you to exclude elevations that are less than, and you can say yes, and then you just tell it what the number is. Or you can do greater than, so maybe somebody has something way too high. So if you have all those things at 0, it'll basically ignore the zeros, which is nice. Another thing that you should also do is if you are adding boundaries, which we haven't discussed in here, that's in the surface class, but when you add boundaries, those should always be pushed to the very bottom of the list, and then the smoothing should be pushed to the very bottom of that. So there's an order of operations here, so operation type, and I'll show you how to maneuver those around in here. So this is the one we've been working on. Let's go to the surface. You can go over here like I keep doing and right click and say surface properties, or you can just go to the surface properties button up here. And I go to the build, here's the build, and I can say, all right, well, exclude elevations less than, and then whatever it is, or greater than. Another one that it has here, besides the less and greater of elevations, is it also has triangle length, which this is kind of cool. So if you know a triangle is longer than a couple hundred feet, it's probably not a good triangle because it's probably just triangulating way out to some other point somewhere. So you can actually tell it to reject anything that is within a certain length, which is really nice. And there's a few other things that are in here too. But basically down this list, so let's just say, for instance, this was in the wrong place because somebody went in and added some contours after the smoothing. And I'm going to tell you something here is basically what you should do when you're doing the contours information like that. If you are going to start editing your surface again and you've applied a smoothing, I always recommend going back into this surface properties, into the definitions, and then I recommend unchecking the smooth and then just hitting rebuild, and then you basically have your surface it's not going to process that every single time you make a change when you have rebuild or rebuild automatic. It won't do that little thing that it was doing down here at the bottom. So it's just a nice way to start editing. And then once you're ready to print your surface or save your file and be done with it for the day, then you can go back in, check it off, and then make sure that you use this little button, or this one, to basically push it down the list. So that should always be at the very bottom of the list. Boundaries should be right above it. Because you want it to basically process all the data, and then you want to put a boundary or boundaries around it, and then the last thing is to smooth after the boundary, because you don't want to smooth before boundary, and you don't want it smoothing after you've added contour data, because then you're going to get weird stuff again. So like I said, I wish I would have known about this definitions list many, many years ago, I'm glad I finally found it one day, and it's been a life changer for helping troubleshoot people's surfaces, and I can also see how you build your surfaces and what things you're doing and not doing. All right. Well, hopefully those helped today. Hopefully you have maybe you have some other questions. Feel free to contact me. Here's my email. I also post a lot of articles on LinkedIn and videos. So we also have a YouTube channel as well, or I do, and I post where this video is going to be. And if you want the PDF, you can basically just email me, and I'll go ahead and send it over to you. And then I'm going to be starting. I had a thing called Infrastructure Universe. We've had some issues with it, so I'm going to rename it to Civil Inspiration Galaxy, and we're going to redo it from there. And hopefully, if you want to sign up for that, just shoot me an email, and I'll make sure you get on that list. Other than that, thanks again, and hopefully you found something useful.